Happy Monday and welcome to Reading the Bible is Easy-ish. I'm Hogan Brock and he is Harrison Litzel. Harrison, we're probably back for the second week in a row. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I do like the gap between when we record these and when they post them. I like that little bit of you never know what's going to happen. Who knows what the next 6 days will bring? But
Yeah, yeah.
when this podcast potentially comes out, I will be at Disney World, and so
Mm,
right now I'm just looking forward to that and getting everything done, so that we can take our almost 3 year old and our 1 year old, and go down to Disney for a few days. So that'll be a good time.
yeah, that'll be a lot of fun. I'll be back in the States. I'll be in North Carolina at the beach. So
Yeah.
Wrightsville Beach. So there will not be a podcast episode in 2 weeks, I guess, or 1 week if you're listening to this. It's very confusing. Harrison, you were just talking about how we record these on Tuesday nights, so that the day after the podcast comes out, and then you have conversations about our podcast with your parents the day it comes out,
Hmm.
and so you dip back into last week's conversation just before we come back on, which is
Yeah.
yeah,
It
yeah.
can be helpful, to kind of work my memory a little bit on what it was we were talking about last week.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, it's a little bit helpful, but it does just feel like, oh, we just did this, and here we are again. And then I kind of forget what we talked about until my parents come home from work and tell me about it. So, mom and dad, look forward to talking to you about this a little bit later. We're at Disney World together, so I don't know when we're going to talk about this. Who knows?
In line, there's lots of line. Robin and Harry, yeah, I don't know what I was going to say to you. So glad you listen. You're the most consistent people, I'm sure. Our text this week comes from Acts chapter 13, verses 16 to 24. Back, I don't know, maybe 3-4 weeks ago, I told you, Harrison, that I was preaching in a few weeks on The Greatest Showman,
Hmm.
which I admitted on the podcast I had not seen. I have now seen The Greatest Showman.
Good.
Um, Turns out I still don't like movie musicals, and that's exactly
Hmm.
what The Greatest Showman is. But it was okay. So this text is going to be matched with that movie, and I will say something about it in a pulpit,
Hmm.
and we'll see if this gets me any closer. So, Acts 13, 16 to 24. So Paul stood up and with a gesture began to speak. Fellow Israelites and others who fear God, listen. The God of this people Israel chose our ancestors and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with uplifted arm, he led them out of it. For about 40 years, he put up with them in the wilderness. After he destroyed 7 peoples in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance for about 450 years. After that, he gave them judges until the time of the prophet Samuel. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, who reigned for 40 years. When he had removed him, he made David their king. In his testimony about him, he said, I have found David, son of Jesse, to be a man after my heart, who will carry out all my wishes. Of this man's posterity, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, as he promised. Before his coming, John had already proclaimed a baptism of repentance to all the people of Israel. So, Harrison, is this a text you're familiar with?
It is not. Yeah, it's not. I feel like it goes over a history that I'm familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I couldn't really tell you much about what's around this passage, really. It's not something that I'm familiar with. What was about this passage? Why is this what you're preaching on this coming week?
Yeah, so there are a couple of places in the Bible. What the idea I'm playing with is the main character in The Greatest Showman is P.T. Barnum,
Hmm.
who founds a circus and has this big dream. Um, in both in the movie and in real life, right? Like he's both the hero and the person who disappoints you.
Mm.
Um, and there are a couple of places in the Bible that use the phrase "a man after God's own heart" or "a man after my heart" to describe David. In David, for a lot of biblical authors, not all of them, but a lot of them, David is kind of the pinnacle
Mm.
of achievement for Israel.
Sure.
Represents this golden age, this age of prosperity, all these sorts of things. Um, and as Paul says here, right, it's from the line of David that we trace Jesus' lineage back to the line of David. And so, but David is not this figure that is just a hero, right? Like there's also many things that David goes through and does that are just atrocities, or just pretty brutal. And so the idea that I'm playing with is no one is everything on their own. There's no such thing as a perfect hero. We're all made from the kind of culture and history that led to us, and so David inherits Saul's kingdom, right? So like whatever David received is has the fingerprints of someone else before him, and so the decisions David makes are informed by that. So yeah, that's kind of the idea I'm playing with, and I wanted to do that in a way that did kind of run through this history that feels like Paul is drawing a very straight line from uh, Israel as God's people and now Jesus, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's the goal of the argument. Um, but he runs through the Old Testament pretty quick, right, and leaves out all sorts of things. Um, and so I think I like playing with that nuance a little bit, and then I'll land on David, and spend time there. But I thought it was interesting to do that in Acts instead of back in First or Second Kings.
Sure. Yeah, it is. I feel like with Bible characters like David, and there are other things like this too. And I think this is something that um, there are a number of other podcasts you can listen to that kind of talk about cancel culture and reputation and the stories we tell ourselves about the people of history or the people of the present. And I am interested in the nuance of what do we do with a person who is revered, maybe wrongfully so, for a lot of the actions that they've taken. A person who history has honored for whatever reason, but when you look at a real account of their life, they did some really terrible things that hurt a lot of people. And especially when that person is central to a narrative that we tell ourselves about ourselves. Somebody like David can't be cast out of our story. It's just not possible. And so we have to wrestle with him, and we have to sit at the table with him and figure out what we're going to do with the things that he did and how that informs not only the nation of Israel and the arguments of Paul, but our faith as well. And I feel like that work is difficult, and I think there's a time and place for it. But I think that is, that it is work that needs to be done.
Yeah, one of the things that I kind of think is interesting is Paul is a character too that as we move through the story, right, like Paul's theology and Paul's story and Paul's understanding of what he's doing changes. He's continually reinterpreting, it seems like to me, or coming to different understandings of what his role in the world is. And I wonder too, like, did Paul's understanding of his own history as a Jew, did that change for him? And maybe not. Maybe there was no nuance in the way that Paul looked at David. But that's something that's interesting for me to think about too. That this is not. I don't know that Paul would have looked at David as just a hero, right? David was more than that. David, had faults and had these things that happened and did some things that were great for Israel, right? Even thinking about Paul, right? Like there are things that are attributed to Paul in the Bible that make me quite uncomfortable, that I don't love. But how do I live with the nuance of Paul can't be separated from my from Christianity, right? Paul's the author of most of the New Testament, but Paul is also not infallible for me.
Right.
And so where do you play in there? I think it's just it's kind of fun.
Yeah. I think with both those people, with David and Paul, it's interesting because we are so far away from them, and the place that they hold in our faith is so prevalent that it's hard to kind of work through some of that nuance. And like you said, understanding potential growth that Paul had or change in his beliefs. I remember James Baldwin is an author that I've probably spent more time with reading his work than any other author. And that was kind of the first time that I feel like I got a sense of his writing over time and got to see his growth and change as a writer and his ideas change. And it kind of made me realize this happens with all people that I encounter in either through their art or in encountering stories of their life. And I just don't always recognize it because I'm not seeing it played over time or anything like that. And I think with Paul, you and I have taken classes where we spent a lot of time talking about the timeline of Paul and when he wrote which book when and all of that. And at certain times in my life, that's felt like a really fruitless effort, one that I didn't want to give time to. But I think there are other times when it's really telling to see how his ideas change. And he thought this at one point, but maybe he changed his mind, and maybe he believed this later. And what does that mean for, like you said, what does it mean if the author of a majority of the New Testament change his mind from one thing to another? What do we do about that when it's both here, not in full conversation with one another? How do we work through that? I think that's a really interesting place to be.
Yeah, and you alluded to it earlier, but I'll be preaching the sermon in Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederacy, right? So there's long been conversation about who's a hero and who's not. And I'm thinking about going into preaching this, right? Like who are the heroes of this congregation? Who I know of a few, right? That their story is nuanced. Like absolutely, they gave a lot to this congregation, but there was also some things about them that are really hard to wrestle with. And so, how do we approach that with as much compassion as we can for the people who are talking about it together, and figure out what it means for us, for that congregation as it informs their identity, and then a bit more broadly. I'm not going to hope that I answer all those questions, but just to kind of push in that direction.
Yeah, that's good.
If you were going to spend more time with this text this week, what would you do?
I think I'm just going to read it again. I don't really have much more to offer than that. Of it is just this kind of concise telling of the history, and to think through what is the story we tell ourselves about who we are, and how does that inform how we behave and how we act and how we see ourselves and others. And I think I just want to read this passage again, kind of with that in mind.
Yeah. I will be spending more time with this passage this week. I know so much of what happens in Acts in just little kind of snippets. I have a hard time putting them all together and kind of getting a feel for how it flows. And so, like you said, I don't know. I mean, I know a little bit of what's going on around this, but I'm having trouble placing this in Acts and in the narrative here. And so that's what I'm going to look at. So if you've made it this far, we really appreciate it. We try our best to be here every Monday. We will not be here next Monday unless something crazy happens. If there's a podcast that posts, then something went wrong. But we are here on Mondays. If you want to make sure that you get every episode that we post, please like and subscribe wherever you found us. Yeah, let us know how you think we're doing at our email address that we don't check, reading the Bible is easy-ish @gmail.com. Any parting words, Harrison?
No, I think you asked me what I'm going to do with the passage this week. I think I'm going to check our email this week. There might be something good in there that we don't know about. Maybe we won a prize or something. I don't know. I'm going to figure it out.
Some spam, probably. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks.